Hi everyone and welcome. Today we're joined by Karin Kneissl, the former foreign minister of Austria. So welcome to the program. It's great to see you again.
Good morning, Professor Diesen. Thank you very much for the invitation.
So you left Austria and moved to Russia, where you now work as a professor at St. Petersburg University. Actually, where I studied myself back in 2006. And you're the head there of the Gorky Center, which is geopolitical observatory for Russia's key issues. And there you're addressing this geopolitical and socioeconomic challenges of Russia, which is a very interesting topic because, as we know, Russia's been making this huge geoeconomic pivot from the traditional West to the East, which I guess really intensified in 2014 when its dream of greater Europe died and it began looking east. But what is interesting with your work is that looking at sanctions and addressing some of the economic challenges is sanctions by the West very much intensified this shift. So you're really the ideal person to speak with to understand what Russia is working on and also why Russia's economy is now outperforming its European counterparts. That is, despite these unprecedented sanctions. So how can you explain the Russian economy, what they are doing, or their main challenges as well as opportunities in this readjustments they're making?
Well, let me start with a quote by the CEO of quite a big company in the minerals area. We had a roundtable on resources and these so-called resource deals that the United States is envisaging with some countries like Ukraine. And this gentleman said, end of April, we did this roundtable at the Gorky. Please don't take away all the sanctions because the sanctions helped us in order to diversify, in order to boost, in order to really find new ways and recruit other people. And the catchword in Russia that you would hear again and again is technical sovereignty. So what companies, government used to buy for decades, they are now trying, not in every area it functions the way they want it, but it's getting better and better to do it themselves. And this goes from, when we speak about technical sovereignty, mining devices in the oil and gas area, but also when it comes to lithium and so-called rare earth metals. But it also, of course, concerns software, software for computers, for all kind of production. I visited companies, for instance, in Altai last year, where I was teaching. Very interesting, small institute, but very, very interesting environment. How people dedicate themselves there to their education, and so in that during that visit, they also made me come to a small but very efficient pharmacy company that works with alternative medicine, but also regular chemical medicine. And they said that in 2022, their software was provided by German pharmaceutical companies. They stopped everything. So from one day to the other, they simply could not go on with the production of their goods. Luckily, in their case, another EU country, interestingly, stepped in and provided them with the software. But they were working on getting their own software. It was all about the software. And so technical sovereignty is something that triggered a lot of innovation. And again, it does not work on all levels to the same extent as the ambitions are there. But it has changed. It has changed above all the pivot in terms of who are your partners and your clients. And here, of course, we see the Asians stepping in. We see India, China. We see other South Asian partners, not only as clients of oil, gas, and other minerals, but also as partners when it comes to obtaining this technical sovereignty. And So this "please don't take away all sanctions" quote, it's very telling, because let me give you another very solid example where it's maybe much more convincing. Russia has become number one food exporter when it comes to wheat, grain, and sunflower oil. They are competing with Ukraine on number one, but when it comes to sunflower oil, but wheat, grain, Russia is number one. And this is only the consequence to the agricultural sanctions of 2014, the counter sanctions by the Russians, because Russia was also a food importer in dairy products, in cheese, for instance. It has changed. So here, Russia has become not only substituting imports by domestic production, but really turning into an exporter. And so the sanctions helped, definitely. And it's like, I know it from my own previous freelance life for 23 years. Whenever you lose a contract, you have to look for something else. You're forced to survive. You're forced to become more innovative. I would have never developed my whole energy topic if I could have well lived on teaching international law. So instead of just teaching international law, I turned into oil and gas areas, which taught me a lot and shaped me a lot. So it's the same thing. When you get pressure, you become more innovative, and it happens to individuals. It can happen to entire state entities, economies. So this is, if I can say in a nutshell, the pressure from outside made the economy more innovative. But there's a little but, of course, to all that. There's a problem. It's openly discussed. Nothing is hidden. And it was also a topic at the SPIEF to a certain extent. It is the high interest rates. And this makes people suffer. You have interest rates of around 20%, and impossible for the average person to take a loan for an apartment, to take a loan because you're running a company. You need to invest. And I have attended several debates where representatives of large entities, medium-sized companies would say this has to change. So the interest rates are a big burden to the economy.
Well, sometimes I get the impression Russia has to relearn. It has relearned some of its lessons from the second half of the 19th century, because at that point, Sergei Witte, the finance minister towards the end of the 19th century, made this comment that we are becoming a quasi-colony for the other Europeans. That is, we export, and we're importing their manufactured goods. Like all our economies is built to fueling their economies. And in the 90s, one got the impression they were falling back into this. That is, Russia was just exporting energy, and then they took the revenue from energy to buy manufactured goods from the West. So it became very comfortable in terms of not being too innovative or challenging, but they deindustrialized and became more and more dependent. So I think this import substitution, it's something that all countries did to establish technological sovereignty. For it's been a common trend for 200 years. So, but usually it's within areas though with this assumption that there is a international competitiveness. So at some point you withdraw the subsidies or protection in assumption that they can be competitive internationally. Sorry, you were going to say.
Yeah, there's one thought that just comes to my mind, if it's interesting for you and for our audience. Let us recall the tiptoeing that the EU did when they wanted to start sanctions against the United States. Oh, not sanctions, was counter tariffs. Sorry, it's a different but somehow similar topic. And the EU did not know where to put the tariffs on, because if they had tariffed bourbon whiskey, the US would have answered with tariffing higher French champagne, Italian wines. They wanted to preempt that. The only thing they were thinking about was Harley Davidson motorbicycles, because all the other things, the EU is terribly dependent on software on technological products coming from the United States, technical services. I remember the Germans discussing in the Bundestag of tariffing the Apple devices when you have an Apple software update, to tariff that. So this was the only way where they thought they could hurt the United States. And in contrast to Russia, the EU does not have an alternative to Amazon. Here in Russia, you have 3 different alternatives to Amazon. You have Wildberries, you have Ozone, you have others. So this works perfectly well. People are into delivery, into the most remote village, like in my place. I can order certain medication for a dog. I can order a certain device I need for the household. Everything arrives within a very short time limit. And all this doesn't exist in the EU. Plus, here in Russia, they developed their own, it existed already beforehand. Pavel Turov and his answer to Facebook was vacay. People use it. So all this technological world, which is more and more dominating. It's not only about oil and gas. It's not only about cars. Cars are relatively easy to produce, but of course the technological dominance by the big tech. There are answers by the Chinese, by the Indians, by the Russians, but not by the Europeans.
So, well, this is maybe the problem of having had too much trust between the Europeans and the Americans. That is, for example, in the early 19th century, when the Americans wanted to decouple from Britain, dependence on its technologies, it's because they feared the British, that they would impede on their sovereignty. The problem I think we had in Europe would be this assumption that we're all in the same club, we're all friends and allies. But if you trust too much, then there's you're prepared to make yourself more dependent on this technology. So I guess the benefit for China, Russia, and others who have more difficult relationship with the Americans would be they have a necessity to create alternatives. So and as you pointed out, tariffs without domestic alternatives just means you're taxing yourself. So it does make much sense. But on this pursuit of technological sovereignty, you mentioned agricultural products, but also the ability to create a digital ecosystem in Russia. The sanctions, though, which were supposed to break the Russian economy, instead, we now see that Russia doesn't, as you said, also appear not to be in a rush to restore the former economic ties with the Europeans, because some of the sanctions appear to be waning now. The Americans want to restore normal relations with Russia. However, the Russians have more or less said that they're not in a rush. Some companies will be let back in, but under strict conditions. Do you know more about this? What conditions, who they will let back in? Is this intended to protect certain domestic and preferred international partners, or is it just a concern about making themselves vulnerable to reliance on what turned out to be unreliable partners?
Well, I have no insight that might be of some sort of explosive news value, and I wouldn't share it if I had. But what I have is the knowledge of a reader, an interested reader, and also my advice that I usually give in roundtables and talks. I always say it's not the time to be too kind, because you would hear Russian authorities say, "Well, we are ready to restart providing gas to the European Union. We can do it." But after everything that has happened, my advice is, first of all, there should be legal compensation, because especially in the commodity sector, there was so much violation of corporate law, of international law, seizing property, and the worst was probably the freezing and now partially confiscating of central bank assets of the Bank of Russia. So this is one thing about being ready to redo business, being ready to go back to normal, I would put a big question mark. I think that you will find people in Russia who would be very, very keen to do so, and you would find others who say, well, let's wait and see, and the government would say under certain conditions. So these conditions, what I've been reading about over the last few months, topic that interests the audience is big brands, textile industry, the shops you will find in the big cities. I'm not living in a big city. It's always for me a different planet when I come to Moscow from my province. But in the big cities, you would see that certain brands never left for the reason that they wanted to continue doing business in Russia, and others were bought by Russian entities. But here, let me remain in the textile segment. It's most maybe a visible one. People in Russia have started to become more aware of their own designers, textile industry. I myself met a young designer in Khabarovsk at the very, very other end of Russia, north of Vladivostok. And I was very much impressed by the energy, the ideas, the creativity of these people, because they say, why should we continue imitating wearing, what for decades was a kind of status? And so it has nothing to do with some sort of nationalist reflex, as some critics would say from the West. It's simply sort of let's develop our own textile tradition, our own ideas that used to be here. And that is, I think, a very, very good development. So if certain brands in the textile segment would come back, then they would face a different audience, that people would say, why should I spend a huge amount on a certain coat if I can have a much nicer, more different coat made by a Russian designer? So these things have changed, I would say, also on a cultural, mental level, the customer's preference. A much bigger area where, of course, there's much more, there was tremendous money lost by the Germans in particular, and the French, is the automotive industry. In the 2 years that I have been living now, I saw it with my own eyes, how the Mercedes and the Audis and the BMWs were not only gradually, but really tremendously replaced by Chinese cars. And so I said it beforehand, and it's very visible here in Russia. In 2020, the last book I published in Austria was about transition of mobility, because I was always very much interested in this automotive industry. It's a barometer of the oil price, and the oil price is a barometer of the automotive industry. So they go hand in hand. It's interesting to observe it. And I claimed in my book 5 years ago that the German automotive industry will face tremendous problems for various reasons. It was far we were not yet in the crisis with the sanctions, but for many other reasons, demographic reasons, people not anymore being able to afford a car or not wishing to do a driving license. And the rise of the Asian automotive industry, that was already visible, but with the loss of the Russian market, the Germans killed their automotive industry. This is a fact. So when I speak to drivers, taxi drivers, there's this possibility with the Yandex app, very, very good taxi services across Russia, wherever you are. And if you want a nicer, a bigger car, you could have in the past order a Mercedes, but today it's not a Mercedes that would come. It's something that looks in between a BMW and an Audi and a Volvo, and it's a Chinese production. And some of the drivers would tell you, well, I miss my Mercedes. I liked it better. And others would say, but this car is just as good as the one I had, but it's much more affordable. So, and these things are changing. So the automotive industry is, I would say, the best example and thermometer to measure the degree of changes inside Russia and with regard to the European Union. So if the German car industry plans to come back, there might be some aficionados, passionate Mercedes drivers who would say, oh, I'm so happy I can buy now the next model of my beloved Mercedes, because it was a huge Mercedes market here. But this, I think this will not be possible anymore, because on the competitive level of efficiency, price, quality ratio, things are changing. So here, I think the loss is there, and the Germans are losing also their rank as export champion, because this rank was assured by the automotive industry, and this is gone. When we take another topic, like coming back of European Western companies, I think that we might see in general, if everything goes according to certain ambitions by Washington and by Moscow, because they have a very ambitious agenda, then you might see that U.S. companies might be allowed to come back in the oil and gas segment, in the insurance sector. I worked a lot on insurance and reinsurance companies. Unfortunately, we have a monopoly in the Anglo-Saxon world when it comes to insurance companies, and there has not been a real substitute worked out. It's a matter of huge investment. But there might be some sort of coming back in those service sectors. And a last word on that. People, I think, are not so much aware of it, but certain US companies really never left. You have in the consultancy sector, Argus, those who work on the oil and gas pricing trading platforms. Some of them never left. BP, which had more than 18% shares in Rosneft, is still de jure there. De facto they left, but de jure they never did all the procedures to get out. Exxon, I'm pretty sure they would love to go back, because they had a huge cooperation in East Sakhalin Island, if I correctly remember. So I could imagine that there would be certain US companies, due to a normalization between Moscow and Washington, that under certain circumstances would come back, because they also fulfilled certain tasks which could not be so easily substituted.
Well, often when we look at the technological, the main, economic connectivity in the world, it can often be divided into three categories. That is the technological and industrial. So you refer to the tech sovereignty, but also the financial connectivity when you look at banks and currencies and payment systems. But the last one is the more physical connectivity, though, the actual transportation corridors by land and sea that connects states. How do you see Russia progressing on this? Because it has many corridors. For example, the Arctic corridor, the international north-south transportation corridor. But you have written, I think that, was it that Rotterdam is the past, Vladivostok is the future, or something along those lines?
Yeah.
Why is Vladivostok on the Pacific coast, for example, growing in such importance, and why is it significant to overcome, I guess, over reliance on the way Russia sees it, at least, the over-reliance on Western controlled transportation corridors.
I think it's very kind that you remember that title I gave to a paper and to a seminar. It is let us start with the Arctic corridor. It's the interesting thing from a legal point of view. It's a national Russian waterway. It's not an international waterway, so it could not be closed down as happened to other corridors, where the Russians were simply kicked out via sanctions. And so the national waterway of the northern route, this northeast passage, which as a consequence of weather changes, climate changes, it can be used not only seasonally, but at certain instances all throughout the year, is a big project. And it's not anymore a project, it's already happening. The challenges there are, you need people. You need people who repair the ship in the shipyards. You need people who work on those icebreakers. They are there. A lot has been achieved by Russian technicians, companies, but it's all about the shortage of skilled labor. This is a huge challenge. And on that, we discussed, we worked, we wrote conclusions, how you can attract people to that part of Russia to work for good salaries and perspectives that you need. It's also all about the infrastructure in those towns. So there are high ambitions. A lot has already been achieved. And why do I think that Vladivostok is the future and Rotterdam is the past? For demographic changes also, because Vladivostok is connected to Chennai in southern India. There is already a lot happening. There's a lot of maritime transport, and China also has a certain demographic challenge, because Chinese population turns old before they become rich, and this is a huge challenge to the Chinese social security system. While India and other Asian states like Indonesia, Vietnam, growing partners of Russia. The Indonesian president was also the main guest at the SPF last week. So those regions, from a demographic point of view, are simply much more the future. And here we are back to topics like mobility, rising living standards. People need to buy certain things. For this, they will need fossil energy. You cannot build an industrial society mainly on renewables. Impossible. You need a backup, buy fossil, buy gas. So these are the partners of the present and growing and gradual and also increasingly of the future. The SPF also as such, and other conferences, I have not so many to compare. First time I attended was 2021, 2022, and things had already changed by then. But where you would see a certain amount of Germans dominating, they have definitely been replaced by Indians, Arab Gulf states. They are also the huge partners now. And so this whole turn to the east, which on paper happened a long time ago. I remember also in the 1980s when I studied in Washington only for 6 months, but majority of seminars at Georgetown University were all about the Asia-Pacific Rim. And that was in the time of the old Bush president, the father of George Herbert Bush. And he was all about this Pacific area. It was all about connecting San Francisco with Shanghai. The US lost that momentum. They focused, unfortunately, on NATO expansions throughout the 1990s. They moved back to Europe, while they should have moved to Asia. And now it's a new world in this Asia Pacific region that is dominated by more and more actors. So unfortunately, Europe is still drowning in its Eurocentrism. You can feel it, you can read it in every moment, every day. And here we are. So I think that Vladivostok, where a lot was already achieved by Russian investments throughout the last 20 years, it's one of the centers of the East.
Yeah, no, I share your concerns about Europe because, well, states do have to adjust to the actual distribution of power if they want to have rational policies in terms of maximizing their prosperity and security. And most of the world are adjusting to these new realities, which is even the United States, of course, attempting to link its economy closer to the East, technologically, financially, also with these corridors. But I don't see it in Europe. I think they are hoping for a world which doesn't exist anymore, this wishful thinking, taking us back to the 1990s, and in doing so, failing to adjust to these realities and, yeah, undermining our own security and economy as quite evident. But one of these institutions which are being put to accommodate these new realities, that is, the new international economic system emerging, is BRICS, though. How important or relevant do you see BRICS being towards this end of reorganizing the Russian economy? Because, well, some people argue that it's not doesn't have much relevance. Others see it as being, I guess, the most critical institution. Or I was wondering where and why you fall on this line.
Well, let me take a little bit of formalistic approach, and I apologize for being formalistic, but since I am coming from the legal field and my head is, so to say, in legal structures, BRICS lacks still a charter. It lacks the institutional level of being something like an organization. I am aware that there were many voices being reluctant, especially the Indians, to turn it into a full-fledged organization. I think that other BRICS members, most probably also Russia, would have preferred to transform it into something that really meets the requirements of being called a real institution, a real organization. For that, you need a charter, you need a founding document, like the United Nations Charter, or like, for instance, the Charter of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So when it comes to institutional mechanisms, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has something like that. BRICS has been mushrooming in all sorts of directions in terms of to people contacts. You have from the sportive side to political meetings to all kind of areas of life. You have now BRICS, a BRICS chapeau that sits on it. But the institutional framing is still missing. And yes, you have a BRICS bank. You have we have a director, Dilma Rousseff, the former president of Brazil. She's working on that with her team, and there are different positions by different stakeholders to create a BRICS currency that would be a game changer. It's not yet there. So BRICS taking my formalistic point of view, I always say it still lacks this legal requirement. On the other hand, on a more, let's say, dynamic and less formalistic approach, you can say, well, BRICS steps in where other organizations, because of their lethargy, because they're outdated, is missing. So I would have, for instance, expected BRICS to take a stance on this Israel-Iran showdown. That would have been a litmus test for BRICS also to appear on the geopolitical level. There was none. There was a lot, but of course there was a lot of behind the curtain diplomacy, which is the only efficient diplomacy. It should not be with press releases and social media. But there were many, many phone calls between Moscow, Beijing, Tel Aviv. So this is something that most probably helped to stabilize the situation, not solve, but manage it somehow. But BRICS as such did not act. I said in an interview also that there should have been something happen. So on that level, BRICS steps in and doesn't step in to the full extent. But of course, there's bilateral diplomacy that did not exist to the same extent as it does now. So BRICS, which started off in the early 2000s, and I remember very well from commodity conferences I attended back then as a tiny analyst, BRICS was all about resource basis. It was, you would hear investors from London, Frankfurt tell, go to the BRICS. They are the commodities providers. These are the big investments to do. Jim Rogers, big investment houses in Germany. I followed it. And from being an object of investment, they turned into a subject of political action, economic action. People would listen. When I became minister in 2017, I asked my colleagues to provide me with our position on Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS. And they looked at me and said we had none. We had never ever discussed it in the European Union councils. So I said, you never discussed BRICS. You never had any paper, any position, any roundtable brainstorming on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Nothing. So this just illustrates the fact that there is a lack of realism in the European Union, because at least discuss it. The US hate BRICS, and when Donald Trump was informed about there is something like BRICS, they want to get out of the dollar and say goodbye to the greenback, his first reaction was no, and it was a very emotional reaction via his social media, as he is. So BRICS would definitely be a stumbling stone in a future relation between Moscow and Washington, but you can handle that if you have smart diplomacy at work. But BRICS is there, and it's not anymore this object of investors, but it's a subject, and but it would be helpful in my opinion, but I admit I'm maybe too formalistic. It would need some sort of legal structure to really turn it into an institution that has mechanism, that, like in the case of this Iran-Israel showdown, would stand up and say, we provide an alternative venue to discuss certain things, to have a meeting ground. And these are my points.
Yeah, I think the Europe ignoring BRICS was it's a bit of the legacies of the unipolar moment, because after the Cold War, I think a lot of the efforts to organize Europe only around European institutions, it led to, for example, just ignoring alternatives. So the CSTO, for example, the post-Soviet military cooperation, that they inquired about the cooperation between NATO and CSTO to avoid zero-sum frictions, to harmonize interest, and this was just rejected. They didn't want to talk to them at all, because once you talk to them, then they're seen as being legitimized, and then you have a competing center of power. And so the best thing you can do is pretend it doesn't exist. It does appear that this is what's being done with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or BRICS. Close your eyes, pretend they're not there. But then, of course, an entirely new world is emerging, and as you said, we haven't even discussed it. So it's a very dangerous field. But yeah, that just takes me to my last question. Do you think, well, now that well, some of this war appears to be reaching the final stages at least, or things aren't going well. The United States, as I said, is looking to normalize relations again with Russia. So is Europe. Do you see the Russians being more accommodating to America than Europe? And also in what areas? Because you've also commented before that, very correct, by the way, that in the East there's more of the real economy, that is the energy, the STEM sciences, while the American economy has become very financialized. So given that a lot of BRICS and the economies in the East would like to get some more autonomy and have a seat at the table in the financial issues as well, not just become absorbed into the US financial system again. Where does the limits go? Where will Russia accommodate, you think, the United States and the Europeans in its economy?
Well, this is a crucial question because on the one hand, we see a very prudent but also effective tiptoeing both by Moscow and Washington in order to advance an agenda. They started in February with this first meeting in Riyadh between the ministers of foreign affairs. There were several phone calls by the presidents. The first one on February 12th was definitely an icebreaker. It it took the Europeans by surprise. We were not informed, we were not discussed. Come on, guys. I mean, who will ask you that the presidents of two big powers make a phone call? But it was very telling how they reacted. They were shocked. And against all odds, this bilateral rapprochement is moving on. And my take of it is the following. There's much more symmetry between Russia and the United States than there is any sort of symmetry between, let's say, Russia towards whoever in Europe, France, Germany. There was a de Gaulle who wanted to have Paris, France, Germany, Russia cooperate already in the 60s. There was always this special relation between the United Kingdom and the US, but there is no symmetry. And you have these big two powers, and I always take geography as the main constant that you cannot change. And geography means that there are two big powers. And we are back to the big power situation. The Russians tried the utmost, and I think it had a lot to do with also the very personal attitude by President Putin, who was very fond of Germany. Fond, I would say, really personally interested in having a good relationship with Germany for various reasons. Maybe it was also the way he was socialized in his youth. But this approach worked only for a certain time, as long as you had certain personalities at work. He himself has said in interviews, ever since Jacques Chirac left in France, I have not anymore the counterpart there, who to talk to. Gerhard Schröder, Angela Merkel were very special counterparts also for him. But as we saw, things developed in a different way ever since 2007. And so I think these personal factors you have to take out, and you have to really focus on what's geography and what history tells you. And there we are back to geopolitics, because it's geography is the constant factor of history. And on that level, there are many, many more chances for a normal, a technical, a day-to-day cooperation between US and Russians. And before I arrived in Russia, I was very ignorant about Russia. I know the Arab world and Iran, but not Russia. I lived in the US for a very short period of my life, but I worked with a US university for many years. So I might say I had some experience with the US. And whenever we speak now about this US-Russia relation, I say there are many, many more similarities also on a social level. I did not know how close societies also were. And this is due to the fact that the Americans have not this burden of history. There were no clashes between US and Russia. Yes, there was the Cold War, but that never was a clash. US and the Russians, if you open up the website of the US Embassy in Moscow, you would still find lots of photo material about the fighting together in World War II. So there are certain elements where you can find consensus in also in reading history, because history is not so much a burden like it is for Germans or Austrians or other Central Europeans. Different story when you are in Portugal or Ireland, but they don't have a big say inside the European Union. So the situation is now the following, that EU is taken by surprise. The consultations on civil servant level continues. There are regular phone calls between President Putin and President Trump. And against all odds, I would say, like this very dense times we had over the last 2 weeks between Iran and Israel, things move on. And this is due to sober-mindedness. And even Donald Trump is sober-minded on that level because he doesn't want to risk anything on that. So during the last NATO summit in The Hague, he did not mention once Ukraine or Russia. It was all about other topics. And so we have now also the strange situation, and I wrote about that a few months ago, that it's not anymore NATO membership of Ukraine that is the big topic, but it's really EU membership of Ukraine, because the EU is turning into a militarized entity. The European Commission is arrogating competences it doesn't have, legally speaking. So here we see a more relaxed attitude by Washington towards Russia. Ukraine is not essential for them. If you can't solve it, then manage it somehow. Nobody here in Russia wants to see it as a frozen conflict. It should be solved. But for Washington, it's not a priority. For them, the old priority that Trump had already during his first administration, it's all about containing China. And so you would hear in Washington, well, we lost Russia to China and to Iran and so on. This is the evaluation. And here is the big point, because Russia definitely will not give up or will not change, or its partnership, friendship without limits, as it's called, with China. This is out of question. And how this can be balanced, this triangle, remains to be seen in the long run. But in the short run, we will see definitely a normalization. And I have been saying ever since late February, there will be direct flights between New York and Moscow before there will be direct flights from Berlin or Vienna to Moscow. So this will be a very symbolic change. And they have a lot to talk about, to share. It's the space. It's the topics of West Asia, Middle East. They have shared interests there, not always at the to the same end, but they both want some sort of stabilization. They both are confronted with terrorist groups with some sort of Middle Eastern background. So all that plays into it. And let me conclude on that. I attended one meeting a few weeks ago in Moscow where the father of Elon Musk, Errol Musk, was there as well, sitting next to Foreign Minister Lavrov. And it was also his first journey to Moscow. And he was very honest, very kind in his statements about this very first journey. Similar to what we heard from American journalist Tucker Carlson, similar what you would hear from maybe other Americans who came to Russia over the years. And there is, on the human level also, I would say, a different readiness to engage. And well, it's mentality and it's geography. The bigger your country is, the easier maybe to meet another big country. Let me conclude on that. I had the chance in June 2021. It's really exactly 24 years ago. I attended as an independent correspondent the meeting between President Putin and George Bush. Bush had just been into office for 1 year. It was before 9/11. And Russia was in a different economic situation than it is today. It was just getting out of the troublesome 1980s, big debts. And I remember very well what Bush said in that press conference back then. He had been traveling across Europe. He had met prime ministers, presidents of all sorts of states. Finally, he arrives in tiny Slovenia and he meets President Putin. And he started the press conference with the following words. He said, "President Putin and I, we have a lot in common. We both run a big country." This for me was very, very telling. We both have 2 daughters, which was this kind of personal approach, Let's interact. Also on a personal level. And he said something which I misunderstood back then, which I better understand today. He said, "And we both believe in God." So you would have 2 countries where religion in public space plays a role, which is different from European Union. And you also have right now on a social level, you have a new wave of conservatism in the United States, which will not end with the Trump administration. I think it will continue. And you have the whole value debate in Russia here is also much more taking place on a conservative level than is Brussels. So all this, I think when you put the larger picture, there is more to converge between Moscow and Washington than between Washington and the Europeans or the Europeans and Russia.
It is a huge shift, though. I remember in the 90s, the Russians referred to all more or less NATO as the bad West and the EU as the good West, but it looks as if there's a good European versus the bad Americans has definitely now switched. So,
Yeah.
anyways, Karin, Kneissl, thank you so much for your time and your insights on what is topics which is not only relevant to Russia, which will be more and more relevant to the whole world, I think. So, thanks again.
You are most welcome, Professor Diesen, and I wish you a good summer with some time for interesting books.